Hello everybody, welcome back to Find My Past from Home. Really hope this finds you well today. Hope you're keeping warm wherever you are. Hope you've got a hot drink in hand. Hope you've got your snack of choice as well. Welcome, my name is Ellie. I'm Senior Community Executive for Find My Past. I'm delighted to be back live actually. This is the first live session I've done for Find My Past from Home in 2022 so far, apart from that one small appearance I had in Friday's Live on Friday when Jen had some technical issues, but that is by the by. We have technical issues, they do happen. Please make yourselves comfortable. Say hello in the comments, introduce yourself, say where you're tuning in from. Even if you're not a regular here, please do feel free to contribute to the discussion. We are always pleased to hear from you. Now, today I'm really excited actually, because this is the first Find My Past from Home session we are doing collaboration with House History Hour. If you're not familiar with House History Hour, they are on Twitter. They are a collaboration of fantastic house historians. They do a session on Twitter, a discussion every Thursday with various different topics and various different guests. So I've got a couple of them with me today, really excited to welcome them. And I'm just going to add them all to the stream now. So we have Professor Deborah Sugg-Ryan. Hello, Deborah.
Hello.
We have Kathy. We
Hello.
have Jill. And last but certainly not least, we've got Karen. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourselves one by one to our lovely community, if that's okay. Deborah, can I start with you?
Yeah, hello. I am the academic amongst the group. So I'm Professor of Design History at the University of Portsmouth. And you might also know me from BBC Two's House Through Time, where I'm the series consultant and I also appear in every episode.
Thank you. Kathy, over to you.
Hello, I'm Kathy Soughton. I'm a professional genealogist and house historian, which I've been doing for the best part of 20 years now. I started off mainly doing genealogy, but nowadays it tends to be mostly house history, although I think the sort of subjects are sort of so intertwined that one often leads to another and back again. And I'm also at the moment the sort of secretary of AGRA, the Association of Genealogists and Researchers in Archives, and we have a number of accredited genealogists and researchers with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Jill?
Hi, I'm Jill Blanchard. I'm also a professional researcher, a family historian and house historian. I'm also an author and tutor and wrote a guide on tracing your house history, and I'm a member of AGRA, of which Kathy is secretary.
Lovely, thank you. And Karen?
Hi, yes, I'm Karen Averby. I'm a buildings historian, writer and a research consultant. Research, write and speak about the history of all types of buildings throughout the UK for diverse audiences. Specialise in house histories, seaside history as well, and also industrial heritage and hotel histories. I've worked in the sector, in the heritage sector for over 20 years, spanning archaeology, archives and architectural history. I'm a former archivist as well. I'm a director of my historical research consultancy, Archangel Heritage Limited, and I work in the commercial heritage sector with those. I've written a few books on various things, and I give talks and workshops in community heritage as well. And I write a local history column for the East London Guardian.
Lovely, thank you so much. There is just so much skill and knowledge between the four of you. It's just astounding. So everybody in the comments watching today, if you do want to take advantage of it, be sure to stick around. And also, if you do have any questions for our lovely panel as well, please feel free to add them into the comments. If you could put the word question at the beginning, that would be really helpful for me to pick them out. We may not get to all of them, but we will try our best. So, in case it wasn't immediately obvious, today we are going to be talking about the houses that we looked up first in the 1921 census for England and Wales. It is now available to search on Find My Past, which is super exciting. It's all about today, who could have lived in your house before you? And if your house wasn't built in 1921, then maybe a house you grew up in, maybe a house your beloved aunt or uncle grew up in, a house that's particularly special to you, perhaps. Who celebrated birthdays where you now celebrate birthdays? Who cooked in the kitchen where you now cook in the kitchen? Who knows? And as we've already said, family history and house history can often go hand in hand. We sometimes use similar sources, and the 1921 census is also, it's not just a way to look up what our family were doing in 1921, it's also a way to look up how they were living. So yeah, that's what we're going to be chatting about today. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a quick sort of open table discussion, and then we're going to move on panelist to panelist, talking about the house that they looked up first in the 1921 census and why that particular house and what they found. Okay, so let's move on to the first talking point then. So I'm going to pass to Karen first, if that's okay. Why do you think so many people are so into house history at the moment?
I mean, there has been quite an upsurge. I think it's very noticeable in the past few years. I think it's a combination of things, and I think we could probably, the rest of my colleagues here will probably agree with the same sort of things, but I think there is better accessibility of records available both online and in person. Local archives where we find these records have higher profile in many areas than they once did as well. And I think history in general is perceived more as something that anybody can actually research and look into as well. It's not just the resident local historian or people with degrees. Everyone is part of history and are just as important as the great and good that we learn about at school. And I think what Kathy was saying as well, house history, very much a follow-on from family history. People research their family histories, found out who their family were, and it's natural to want to know what their lives were like, where and how they lived, and how their living conditions may have influenced the decisions they made, for example. So everything is intertwined, but I'm absolutely loving the fact that everybody seems, well, not everybody, but a lot of people seem to be more interested in their house history as well. It's wonderful.
It's great, isn't it? And I think some of that can be contributed to the success of the House Through Time programme as well. Deborah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think A House Through Time has really helped provoke the interest in house history, and certainly, the viewing figures have been amazing. It's incredibly unusual for a history series to be commissioned, recommissioned. So, the fact we've had 4 series, there are not, obviously, Who Do You Think You Are has been running for years and years and years, but I think it's sort of testament to the kind of interest and success, and certainly we wouldn't have been recommissioned if the viewing figures weren't as good as they are, and I think it's just also a very fresh, kind of approachable, relatable way of telling social history as well, that gets you into the lives of ordinary people, which are sometimes very extraordinary.
Absolutely. Jill, what are your thoughts? Why are we so into house history right now?
I think there's been for probably 30, 40 years or more a growing interest in social history, and people who are interested in family history tend to become interested in social history, local history and community history. And I think it's kind of evolved out of that people realise that history is more than just, as Karen said, about the great and good, or the so-called great and good. And I think a house history to me is the perfect micro history, something I say over and over again. It's all about people, it's all about place, it's all about local history and buildings, of course. It's everything that we could possibly want to know about how people lived and what their lives were like around them, because it isn't just about the one building, it's about everything around them.
I love that phrase, a micro history. It is like having a little microscope in on that house, but as you said, it's also the people who lived around them, who lived on the street, who lived in the area, and their lives all intertwined. Kathy, what do you think? Why this sudden surgence in wanting, I don't think that's even a word, surgence. Why do we suddenly want to know who lived in our home before us?
Because I think it's all about sort of connecting with the past again. I think, as the others have said, there's been a number of TV programs like A House Through Time, and also Who Do You Think You Are, which sort of focuses sort of people and makes them aware that it's something they can do themselves. It's not just the celebrities or whoever. They can look at their own backgrounds and their own houses to sort of try and find out more about their ancestors and where they lived. And I think it's one thing knowing what they did and who they married and all the children, but I think if you can connect and find out where they actually were brought up and what the house looked like, assuming it's sort of still standing and that thing, sort of thing. But often you can find old photographs of it as well, even if it's no longer there. So I think it all brings that sort of sense of perspective, and more people are interested in finding out more. And I think now, you know, obviously with things like the 1921 census, it's easier to find out records as well. So sort of people are delving in to sort of see what they can find.
And I wonder as well, given that so many of us have become even more acquainted with our homes over the past 2 years than we would normally be, I wonder whether that's got something to do with it. I don't know if anybody wants to chip in there.
I can chip in there. I mean, I think there's definitely been an upsurge in the pandemic with people spending more time at home and working from home. And I think so it's been one of the things that you've also been able to do online too. And, you know, I think we've got people who have maybe done their family tree, and house history is another way of using those skills, or people who are just increasingly fascinated about the house in which they live. But I'm sure that, you know, lots of us spending more time at home is a factor in this as well.
Something I realised the other day, I live in an Edinburgh tenement flat that was built in 1872, and I saw something online the other day, and it was a chap who sort of restores his own Edinburgh tenement flat, and he comes across various things, and he talks through why he's doing what he's doing when he's refurbishing and things like that. And he was talking about his pantry, and on this video clip on social media, he showed his pantry, and I'm like, that's what mine looks like. And I know now that was an original feature, and I didn't know that before. And then I'm standing there in front of my pantry going, I wonder who else has stood here getting stuff out of the pantry. And it's quite a powerful thought, actually. Okay, let's move on then. So we've got this new 1921 census for England and Wales, which is really exciting. But in general, why are census records such a vital a vital resource for house historians? Because when they were first taken, I don't think anybody who was organising the census ever thought that they'd be used for house history 150 years down the line. What do you think, Jill? Why are they so vital?
Well, I think that's a really good question, because it's important when we look at those records to know the history of why they were created and why they've changed over time. And the census was taken to record population figures. And as it expanded over time, more and more data was collected and still is collected mainly to do with things like funding, where funding will be targeted, which is why over time there were questions asked such as about things like disability. And then in 1891 for England and Wales, Scotland and Ireland are different. They've actually always been a little bit more detailed. It's the first question that actually asked anything about a household, which was to list the number of rooms if there were less than 5. And then, of course, the 1911 is the first one that gives us the total number of rooms apart from what we call service areas, so we have to have that context about that these were obviously not created for us. They were created by the authorities in order to consider where money would go for things like education, and then when we get into the 20th century towards health, particularly. And the disability question is a really interesting one, because it was about funding and provision of things like asylums and workhouses and so on.
Yeah, there's so much detail you can gather from census records in general. Deborah, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think the thing that really has been fascinating me from 1921 census, which is also there in 1911, is the number of rooms, because I think it gives you real insights into how the household lives. There's a slight difference in 1911, the householder filled in the number of rooms, and the enumerator did it in 1921. Sometimes you'll see corrections from 1911, and I can see already in the comments, some people commenting that they found differences in the same house between censuses, and there are several reasons for that. One is our houses don't stay the same; they're often altered. So to give you a nice example from a house through time, our Bristol house, we realised had a whole series of makeshift buildings at the back of the house. And we know that some of those were demolished over time. And the kitchen at one point was in a completely separate block. So just be aware that houses change. The other thing that causes the real problems in the counting of rooms are kitchens and sculleries. That people are told to count the kitchen and not the scullery. However, the term scullery means different things in different parts of the country and different things to different people. So the instruction that's given in 1921 is to count the scullery as a room fits somewhere where you eat meals. If anyone wants to look a bit more at the methodology behind counting number of rooms, if you go on to the Visions of Britain website, I will put the link in the comments. You can see the 1927 report on the 1921 census, which explains some of the thinking behind that, but it can be a bit confusing that sometimes the number of rooms is not tallying up with what you know. However, the other thing you really need to be aware of, especially if you're looking at 1921, is you will get families recorded as separate households at the same address. Often if it's an extended family, you will get them recorded differently. So my advice is to cross-check with an address search as well. And I have just encountered this with something I've been looking into with my family history and realized it's 3 branches of the family living at separate households at the same address. So sometimes that's why you're not seeing the total number of rooms. And then in that instance, the other thing that is a decision has been having to be made that maybe actually some of those rooms might be shared, but they're making a decision about which rooms are being attached to which household. And I think particularly if we think about cooking facilities and washing facilities, that there might have been a bit of confusion around that, and that might be why some of the adding up doesn't quite work. And remember, between 1921 and 1939, if you're seeing those differences, there's quite a lot of modernisation going on in houses then, particularly with bathrooms and kitchens.
Well, I hope that answers your question, Sally, and obviously if anybody else has asked the question about the rooms as well. Kathy, what is it about census records and house history then for you?
I think because obviously they were just taken every 10 years and just give a snapshot of who was living in that property on that particular day that the sort of census was taken. But I think for house historians and family historians too, obviously, they provide sort of, if you like, one of the sort of key pieces of the jigsaw in terms of finding out more information about the property and who lived there. So you can use them as a way to sort of find out sort of so much more, and as a sort of stepping stone to other records. Obviously they just state who was there at the time, so it may be that you've got other family members living elsewhere at the time, but I think they just sort of provide a link to looking then at other records to sort of help fill in the gaps as well. But I think sort of far as sort of historians concerned, they're in a sort of essential guide to sort of finding out more. And I think particularly like there's the 1911 census, because that was taken around the sort of same time as the valuation survey records were produced, where every plot of land in England and Wales was assessed for tax purposes effectively, and alongside the maps which showed every plot there was a corresponding sort of field book or valuation book which provided information, so you can sort of tally that with the sort of census return. And it's all about sort of building up the blocks to sort of find out more information. But they're a key record, and I think sadly it's a shame that the 1931 census hasn't survived, and there wasn't a census taken in 1941. So we've got a long time to wait until the next one is available for the 1951 census. And although we've got the 1939 register, which is really useful, it's the last of the sort of big set of records that's going to be available for quite some time. So
I think that's a really valid point. The fact that you can treat census records as a stepping stone, I think it's a great starting point for a beginner, or for when you're just starting out researching the history of a house. But as with family history, don't just use that one record. Use it as a stepping stone. Use it to find other information, because as we've already said, census records are only taken every 10 years. You've only got that little snapshot in time, and the occupation of houses was actually, it turned around quite a lot. Do you agree, Karen?
Very much so. I mean, a couple of the houses I'm researching at the moment, they're both early 19th century, but each one has over 40 different separate households to research within, I think just into the 21st century. So that's a lot of people to be researching. So yes, there is a very high turnover in some houses. Some houses you research, there'll be one family there for a very long time. What I really like about census records, there is a gap, but it's a consistent gap. We know when we use other records in house history, they vary in their degree of survival. So one parish might have a very comprehensive rate book collection, but the neighbouring parish might not have any. But generally speaking, there will be a census record for your house every 10 years, from 1841. And yeah, there is still that 10-year gap, but it is a consistent 10-year gap. So you know that if you're starting your house history, you can start and look at those 10-year periods and then fill in with other things like rate books or electoral registers. But one thing I wanted to just note about the census forms is that they're standardised pro forma forms. So you can sort of compare neighbouring houses, especially if houses are seemingly uniform, such as like a row of terraces. We can look at the number of rooms, as Deborah mentioned, in the later censuses with that information. And we can also see how many households were occupying the same space in the same street as well. And I find that very useful when we're looking at our house that we're researching in context, with the neighbours as well, just seeing, is it just an anomaly that one house has 5 families in it? Or is that what's happening in the neighbourhood in the rest of the street as well?
And before we go on to our sort of main discussion today about the houses you looked at first, so just one more question for all of you, and I'll throw this to anybody who would like to answer, just in case there's anything we haven't covered yet. But the 1921 Census of England and Wales is hopefully going to be a great resource for family historians, house historians alike. Why we've waited 100 years for it. I say waited 100 years, but it's been 100 years under lock and key. Why now is it going to be hopefully important and vital to house historians? I throw that to anybody who'd like to answer.
Well, I think Deborah's sort of touched on it, and so is Kathy, by saying we've got some big gaps before the next big data sets. And the 20th century can be very hard to research, surprisingly, to a lot of people. And so we're very dependent on things like electoral registers. And this is a key moment in time, because from 1918 onwards is only when some women could vote. It's not till 1928 all women could vote on the same terms as men. So some of the other sets of records don't record people to the same extent. So it really gives us that sort of launch pad into later decades as well. And also things like electoral registers and trade directories weren't being compiled or published during the 2 world wars. So you've got gaps there as well. So it was a very big moment. There was a lot of changes in society in that time period, post-war, and I think it really sort of helps us encapsulate a massive change, societal changes that were going on.
I completely agree. Deborah, yes.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that, because I've written a book on the interwar home, and so I start the book in this immediate post-war period. And for me, I think what's really interesting is the big shifts in women's lives, in terms of women. Lots of women. There's this idea of a servant problem, and although domestic service is still the biggest employer of women, it's starting to shift. Women are living out more rather than living in, which you'll see reflected in the census when you look at the address of where people are living. So that is one change, but women are also doing things like factory work. We can see them in shops, we can see them in other occupations, but you've also got these, you're on the cusp of really big changes in people's living conditions. There's an idea that the living standards of the better off middle classes are in decline because there's been this massive post-war inflation. And then you've got the big beginnings of kind of big transitions in the growth of this lower middle class, who are really well reflected in newspapers like the Daily Mail, that are really appealing to people's aspirations. And really the interwar period is the period where home ownership starts to take off. And one of the things I've been really fascinated, I've been doing since the census was released, is looking back on some of the research I did for the book, and really, really delighted to find that some of my case studies, as I had hoped, one of them was a domestic servant. By the early 30s, she's a homeowner. And these are such big transitions. And I've looked into how her family were living in 1911 and 1921, and the differences between their standard of living in terms of kind of space and other conditions. And then, of course, we've got the growth of social housing as well, with the Homes for Heroes home building campaign. So you're on the cusp of these really, really big changes, and this kind of sense of modernity. But it's, we're not full of flappers in 1921. It's you're on the cusp of that world, and there's loads of you will be finding your relatives are out of work in 1921. I've certainly found huge swathes of my family out of work. So it's a very kind of divided place, but on the cusp of big changes.
Karen or Kathy, would you like to just round us off at all?
I just want to follow on from what Deborah was saying about employment, because one thing that I'm really excited about the 1921 census is the place of employment column. It's really interesting. Of course, on earlier censuses, occupations listed, but you have to look at potential places in an area where factories and shops, etc., were located. Not an exact science of trying to work out where your occupants were working. But the 1921 census allows us to map a person's commute in a way, and we can sort of see, if they're not home working, whether they might have travelled by train or bus or on foot. If local places of employment were local, such as factories, and we're looking at how far people were travelling for work, and indeed whether members of the same family were working at the same place, as was often the case perhaps in earlier periods. And in the case of where people are home working, looking at the space in the house, where were they actually working? So I find that very, very sort of exciting thing to explore. I feel like I'm on the cusp of, there's so much more to sort of look at houses I'm currently researching, but also ones I've done before as well. I just want to revisit those and just take a wider look at that.
Lovely. Right, before we move on, I'm just going to bring up a couple of community comments here. So Audrey, my best friend Audrey, hello Audrey. One of the people living in my house in 1921 was a 12-year-old girl. She lived in the house for the rest of her life and was still there when my neighbour moved in about 40 years ago. Wow, I love that. That's fantastic. Okay, I'm just scrolling through the comments here, and I'm just going to bring a couple of these up. Kathy says, my house was built in 1826. That's an old house. I'm going to leave the questions for now. We'll try and get to those at the end if we can. I'm just scrolling through here. Catherine says, I've had a quick look at the pages relating to my small rural village and noticed a lot of people living in the village who weren't born there. This is a huge change from 1901, 1911. Yeah, that's amazing. Lots of people moving there. Okay, what we're going to do now is we are going to move to the main section of our discussion. And what I asked our lovely panelists to do is to tell us a little bit about the house they looked up first. So when the 1921 census went live on the 6th of January, which one were they itching to look up? Why? And also what they discovered. And I think, according to my notes, I'm going to ask Deborah to go first.
Yeah, well, this is quite a difficult one. I made a spreadsheet actually of them in order a few days
Very organised.
So I thought from the house perspective, because I had a family history query first, but I thought the first house history I looked at was the house I live in. So I live in a house in Southsea, which is part of Portsmouth, and it's the end of a terrace, and it's the kind of house that was built for the middle classes. The houses were built in the late 1870s, and in the 1881 census, as you would expect from Portsmouth, it's full of quite senior military people and people who are doing sort of well off in trade and professions, people like solicitors, people who own drapers' business, that kind of thing. And nearly every house has a servant in 1881, and some of you might have. It's on the BBC Sounds at the moment, but I just took part in a programme called The Secret History of the Staircase, and I used the 81 census record from my house to talk about the servant who lived in my house. So the first occupants are an army captain aged 60 and his wife who's 20 years younger, and 3 children. And what is extraordinary is the youngest child, Thurza, who was only 4 in 1881, lived in the house until she died in 1946, and she inherited it from her parents, even though she went on to have, there were 2 more children born. So she had 4 brothers, but the only girl got the house. So I really didn't think I was going to find very much, because I'd seen 1911 and I'd seen 1939. So Thurza was educated surprisingly well, and she actually went to the University of London. I don't think she got a degree, but in 1901 she was working as a governess. And after her father died in the 1880s, just after the birth of the 2 younger children. Her mother died in 1905. So in 1911, I found her in the house as head of the household, age 34, without an occupation, keeping house for her brothers, Harold and Frank. And she's still there with them again in 1921. So that was sort of what I was expecting to find. And one brother was working in the same, I've now got the name of the shop, which is brilliant. I knew he was an ironmonger's assistant, but it's named it. But actually, the thing that wasn't transcribed, and something we haven't talked about, is about the importance of going to the original image, is it also says on the record that he was not only working as a keeper at the ironmonger store, he was also an employer because he was owner of a taxi cab, which I thought was a really fantastic 1921 professor. Now, the other brother, Frank, is a clerk in holy orders. And I know from the previous census in the Colonial Church of South Africa, but it doesn't give a place of work. And I thought, well, what is he doing in 1921? And when I went to the British Newspaper Archive, I found an advert for 1923 under the name of the house. My house was called Minden, advertising it as a preparation school for sons of professional men. At prospectus on application to the Reverend Smith. And I wondered if Thurza, who lived there, was also helping with that. But the thing that was hugely surprising was a child. So these are 3 unmarried people. I lose touch of the Reverend. I can't trace him in 1939, but the other brother lived with Thurza, never married. And there's a 6-year-old, and he's the nephew. He's the son of one of the other brothers. And what I discovered is that the other brother has died. I haven't found a military record. I'm wondering if maybe it's Spanish flu. And his wife has remarried, but there's a daughter she already had with the son who died, and the man she's remarried has also got a child from his first marriage. So to me, that points for some really big themes for our period: the growth of these blended families, what you do with children who've lost a parent, and you know, this idea of orphaned children or children who's lost one parent, how do families accommodate them? So for me, I think this is really, really fascinating, because all of a sudden we've got Thurza in her 40s, and I presume this is falling on her, age 44. She's suddenly got this child in the house. So you know, from something I thought, oh, it won't be very exciting, actually it's turned out to be really interesting, and helped me sort of understand this idea of remarriage and the kinds of subsequent lives that people had.
That's incredible. Just obviously you've already done the history either side, as you said, with 1911, 1939, and the other resources that you've used, but just that one extra record has opened up so many other avenues and so many other themes around this house. And I think that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, Deborah. I really appreciate it. And Kathy, could we move on to you, if that's okay? Which house did you look up first?
Which house? Right, well, I cheated a bit as well, because the first couple I looked at were sort of family history related ones. So my grandparents, because I knew where they lived from other records, but so I looked at those first, and that they confirmed very much what I thought. You know, the family members who I was expecting to see were living there, and there were no sort of great surprises, other than I found out who one of my grandfathers was actually working for. He was a solicitor's clerk, so it's nice to find the name of the company he was employed by, the solicitors. So that sort of gives me something that I can look into as a sort of future sort of task to look at. But the one I'm sort of interested in from a professional point of view, it's a house history I'm working on at the moment, where the owners of the current property, which is now a private house, wanted it's the husband's birthday next month, so they were hoping to get it all wrapped up literally for next month. So the property in question, it was originally built as a sort of private property, but for much of the 20th century, it was used for other purposes. For about sort of 15 years in the early 1900s, it was classed as a sort of holiday home for girls, which apparently they had a number of poor sort of working girls from London come and sort of stay there in the summer, just as sort of respite. And it was all that they got the money from charities, and the owners at the time raised they held what were called pound days to get income coming through to sort of support the house and fund it. And I also found during the First World War, it housed Belgian refugees as well. So it's got a really interesting history, even though it's not particularly old. It was sort of only late Victorian. But I was particularly interested in the 1921 census, because I knew about that time that it sort of changed ownership and status, in that it became a school around then, and it remained a school until well into the sort of 1960s. But I wasn't quite sure who when that happened and who all the teachers were and that sort of thing. So the 1921 census was really useful in that respect, in that it shows that living there on the day the census was taken, there were two principals of the school who were employers, and that was sort of two ladies. They were both sort of middle-aged, both unmarried, which I think was pretty much the norm for sort of school teachers in the period. There was also an assistant mistress who worked for them. The owners were classed as the employer. There was a couple of servants. One was a cook, the other was a sort of housemaid. And then there were also 4 boarders, because it was then a private, set up as a sort of small private school, both for boarders and for day pupils. And the boarders, really interesting in that they were all quite, I think the youngest was 8 and the eldest 12. And out of the 4, 3 had sadly lost their fathers. And that's a new piece of information that was included in the 1921 census. So I think that's quite telling. That now, whether that was one reason why they went to the school, I mean, it was a fee paying school, so they'd had to have somebody within the family would have had to have the means to provide their education, unless it was done on a sort of charitable basis. But I haven't found out in what circumstances their parents died. The father died, rather. It may have been presumed during the First World War, because 800 odd thousand men, Englishmen, sort of died in that period, or possibly sort of Spanish flu. But it's interesting just sort of seeing the makeup at the time. The other interesting thing about it is that it was classed as an institution rather than a particular address, and which I think for the majority of institutions that are classed as such in the 1921 census, they were things like, prisons and asylums and that sort of thing. So it was quite interesting to see this classed as such, whereas I was expecting it just to sort of be a private property, as it were. And one thing I did note, and I was going to sort of query this, that it doesn't actually show the number of the number of rooms in it, which I was sort of hoping to find and compare that against the 1911 census or whatever. That sort of section of the form is just blank. So whether they thought for institutions, it's not something that was necessary. There was sort of too many rooms possibly to take account. But it's an interesting, fact about it. But yeah, basically it was just a really useful bit of information, and I'm just sort of so glad it was there. And also I think if it had been taken a month or two later, then some of the children may still have been there, but it might have been a different sort of set of circumstances, because I know during the sort of summer, from newspapers articles, the owners often rented the house out during that period. So it all depends, when the census was actually taken, as to what time of year, as to who was there at the time.
Absolutely. And I've heard this a lot from members of our community, saying things like, if the census had been taken when it was supposed to have been taken, my family member or my ancestor would not have been included on it. So I think that's quite sweet, actually. But just what you were saying about the fact that with the 1921 census, it records whether your parents are still alive or not. And just that little bit of information that may tell you a little bit more about how that property was used, I just think is fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that, Kathy. Thank you. Karen, would you like to tell us about your chosen property?
Yes, I think, like Deborah and Kathy, this was a really difficult decision, which to choose, which to look at first. I've got 5 house history commissions on the go at the moment, and each one would have been enhanced by the 1921 census information. I've got a 17th century mill house, which in the 20s was probably lived in by a family not actually working the mill. 2 early 19th century townhouses in Islington, and I did actually look those up afterwards and found in both cases households that weren't appearing in other records, so fabulous. A Victorian terrace in Leighton as well, and a seaside residence in Dorset. But I found myself awake at midnight on census release day, and I just thought, I'm going to hop on and not going to do any work, but I'm going to look at the house where my nan was living in 1921. I just figured work-related things, could wait till morning. And there were several things about the house my nan lived in, which I had been sort of curious about and looking forward to finding out a bit more. So I knew that she'd grown up in a back-to-back house in Birmingham, next to Bristol Street, if you know the city centre. The road is still actually there, Vere Street, but the houses and pubs that were on the street have long since gone. I think probably by the 60s they were gone. And the school and the church there, St Luke's, have only recently been demolished actually for some redevelopment going on there. I didn't know how many rooms the family were living in, or indeed how many of my nan's siblings were still living at home. It was quite a large family. The details have been a bit sketchy. Obviously, family history stories getting passed down, you don't know what's true and what isn't. And it's especially important with houses like these back-to-backs that are no longer there, because they don't exist. There's a few examples around the country. So any source that can tell us about these houses is going to be, really interesting and really crucial. And especially as well, we as house historians were concerned not only with a particular house that was tasked with researching, but also as we research former occupants, we look at the houses they lived in before and afterwards as well. So we are essentially doing house histories within house histories when we're doing this sort of thing. So I did a name search for my nan, Hilda Campini, but no joy. So I did an address search, which brought up 55 households on the street. And it didn't look as if they were going to be at the same address as they had been in the 1911 census, although they were actually living on the same street, different house. I did a bit of cheating, and I had electoral register entry for 1926 for my great-grandfather. So I looked up that address in the 1921 census, and there they were, number 49, Vere Street. No other households at that address, so that was sort of answered that question. It was just my nan and her siblings and her mum and dad. And there were 5 adults there, my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, mid-50s, my 3 great-uncles aged 23, 18 and 17. My nan was 13 at the time, and my great-aunt, my nan's younger sister, who was 10. So you've got this sort of 5 adults, 2 children. And so the number of rooms was quite interesting, and 3 rooms. I wasn't surprised at that, but it does sort of confirm, how many rooms that these people were living in, and where were they sleeping, where were they eating. It is really, really interesting. The interesting thing about how it worked, how it all went together. And I've mentioned before about employment. So of great interest were the places of employment for the men in the household, because my great-grandmother wasn't working, to see where they were working. And in fact, 2 of them were not in work, although their places of employment were listed. They were out of work at this time. So that was really interesting. And the places of work were all within walking distance. Birmingham at that time, of course, had many industries still close to the centre, alongside rows and rows of back-to-backs where the workers lived. My great-grandfather's employer was recorded as Pierce and Cutter in Broad Street. I think the firm actually still exists in some sense, but at different premises. He was actually out of work, although that's where he would have worked, and that was about a mile away. So that was the furthest place of employment in the household at the time. One of my great uncles was an out of work glass cutter. He had worked at a place called O.G. Hawkes, which was 10 minutes away. And my other great uncle Louis was a French polisher for a very small one-man band, I think, 5 minutes walk away from there. And Charles Campini, another of the brothers, was a die cutter for the Birmingham Aluminium Company, which is in a road called Easy Row, which is an area of Birmingham which has been now transformed beyond all recognition. So I did actually print it off here, but it's printed off really small. Yeah, it was quite an interesting exercise just to bring all that together and just to add that in. And it feeds into the social and economic history of not only that local area as well, but the wider history of Birmingham and industry and economics as well. So I just found that fascinating.
Yeah, and as you said, it's just that little piece of the puzzle, isn't it? And you can, reading how many rooms were actually in the house, you can sort of picture it a little bit better as well. And, what you said about being awake at like midnight on launch night.
I'm sure many.
No, I think I did an all-nighter that day, so that was fun. So yeah, but I found a really good comment a little bit further back. I can't see where it is now. Somebody says about looking up houses on Google Maps. I do exactly the same thing. If I'm researching a house or I'm researching an ancestor, I have to go and look on Google Maps. But does anybody else get sort of a really sinking feeling when you find it on Google Maps, you open it and you can tell that it's no longer there? I feel so sad when I see that.
Yeah.
Oh, I think we lost you there, Karen. Jill, last but not least, I would love for you to tell us about the house you just had to look up first.
Well, I also cheated slightly because I looked up 3 in side by side, 2 for personal projects for biographies I'm writing, and one of which was a woman who was supported the suffragette campaign and doesn't appear on the 1911 census. And I know that she supported it because the man who filled in the household form in 1911 said he refused to enter the names of any women in the household in support of the campaign for women's votes. So all I knew was where she, it's from earlier census returns, and I wanted to know where she was, and I also wanted to confirm that she had 2 addresses, because there's I come across various references which indicated she spent time in Norfolk and in London, and it's all part of the story about what she got up to. She also lived on and co-founded one of the first communes in England. So I want to know whether she was on the commune in 1921, which she wasn't, but she was living in one room in a house in London. So that was what I wanted to find out about that one. So there's still a bit more to investigate. But the one I did for work for a client was a house in Ely, which had only recently identified as a former pub. It has no house number until towards the end of the 1920s. It has no name on most records at all, even though it was a pub. So it proved a particularly challenging one to search. And when I put in the street name, only 6 properties came up on that street, and I know there's a lot more. So I did what Karen did. I did a lot of comparing with with electoral registers. I knew who was in the pub in 1911, but I'd also got the Inland Revenue Valuation Survey, sometimes nicknamed the Lloyd George Doomsday, and that has a date on it for October 1913, and that did name the pub and confirmed it was the pub in 1913, and it was owned by a brewery. It was also a lodging house. And in 1911, as well as the household that lived there, there were 9 unnamed male lodgers. So if you've got people who were hawkers or travellers, it's something to remember that their names don't always appear on census records. They're sometimes just listed as unnamed, and whether they were male or female. So I wanted to also know whether or not it was still a lodging house in 1921, who was running the pub, who was living there. I found a family called Neal towards once numbers start appearing on electoral registers, but I didn't know if they were there in 1921. So I worked with that name, the Neal surname, and I did a search on it looking for occupations to see if I could narrow it down, so I didn't have to spend lots of money looking at every entry. And I put in publican, innkeeper, etc., and that's what the result came up. Up came Robert Neal, publican, and there were 2 pubs on the street at that time, and I was able to narrow. The other one had the name of the pub, so I knew it wasn't that one. So when I looked at it, it didn't give the pub name, but I was then able to use that information to confirm that the Neal family had been there for that time. And one of the interesting things for me was that, he died a few years later and his son took it over. So it led me to lots of other things, was that it said he was a publican of his own account. Now, in 1913, when the valuation survey was taken, it was owned by the brewery and they had a tenant in the pub. So this raises a question, does own account mean that he'd taken over the pub from the brewery or not? I still wouldn't like to say 100%, but it indicates that there's been a change has occurred. And they only had 4 boarders. The number of rooms was the same as in 1911, 6 rooms. But the interesting thing is that the Inland Revenue Survey gave me a little bit more detail because it listed 4 bedrooms, 2 front rooms and an attic. So that obviously wasn't included in that number 6 rooms on the census. And the people who were boarding with them were interesting. There was someone described as a peppermint traveller. I'm not quite sure what a peppermint traveller was.
I've never heard of that before.
I presume it was something to do with selling confectionery or peppermint of some kind. And he had no fixed place of abode, was what was noted. He was married, but no other details. The other one was a hawker in the drapery trade, and the other person who was a boarder was a basket maker. So they were obviously still operating as a lodging house as well as a pub. So I kind of found out what I wanted to know, which was to fill in my gaps until I get to 1939. And I know that it stopped who was there then. So, yeah, I was very pleased with that. But it did take a lot of creative searching of the indexes to narrow down which property it might be.
I had to do the same. And although I did prepare an example to share today, everybody, what I think I will save that for another time, because I'd like to get to some questions, if that's okay. But I completely agree with you, Jill. Sometimes you do have to be quite creative with your searches, and don't always expect that the details that you have is exactly how it's recorded, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It may be recorded slightly differently, which is why I think the word creative is great. Guys, thank you so much. Your examples are fantastic. And I just love having all of these, as you said, micro histories of these properties. And these are just little windows into these properties as well. There's so much more that you guys have already explored. And hopefully it's inspired you, our wonderful community, to go and have a look. And as Beth says, yes, this is exactly right. Think outside of the box. Absolutely. Okay, what I'm going to do now in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to scroll up and I'm going to try and find some questions. And if anybody would like to just jump in and answer the questions, because we're quite short on time, that is completely fine. So I'm just going to scroll, and I'm just going to talk as I scroll, because otherwise we have sort of awkward silence. So I'm just going to keep going. We're just going to see if we've got any questions in here. Okay. Question from Kathy. How can I find out when the Barrington School, I can't pronounce this, stopped being a school? Would anyone like to take that one?
I think that there's sort of so many different records you can look at for that. I mean, one of the really good resources are the sort of local newspapers, which Findmypast have, and also sort of British Newspaper Archive, and you can sort of search through those, sort of searching on the Barrington School, and that might, assuming the relevant local newspapers have been digitized, that might help. Other records like trade directories, electoral registers, rate books, they're sort of various different sort of sources you can look at. I mean, it sort of obviously depends what sort of rough period you're talking about, but because the various records span different periods sometimes, but yeah, you should be able to certainly narrow it down.
Yeah, I mean, if it was a state school and it's after the introduction of the Education Act of 1871, then the education records in the local archives are well worth a look. You might have to plough through quite a few minutes. So Kathy's suggestions of narrowing down a time frame will really help. But they should record when it stopped being a school, and other things to do with the appointments of head teachers and so on.
I'd always in the first instance contact your local archives, who will have all of these records, but always that would always be my first suggestion. We need to use our local archives more. I think they're just rich sources of local history information, but all of those records that Jill and Kathy have mentioned will be there, and if they're not there, they will point you in the right direction as well.
Lovely, thank you so much. Okay, question from Anya. Where would you advise we look for maps of house numbers from the 1921 census for buildings and streets that are no longer there? I have not found what I was hoping for on the National Library of Scotland maps, which are excellent, by the way, but I'm sorry to hear that you haven't found what you were looking for. Any ideas on this one?
I think we're all going to say you might want to step back slightly in time and look for the Inland Revenue Valuation Survey maps, because they plot every plot of land and the buildings on them for the whole of England and Wales between 1910 and 1915, and for Scotland up to 1920. Now, there are the main series of records at the National Archives, but they are in the process of being digitised by the genealogist company. But also you may find there are copies of the maps and some of the other local records at your county archives, because they will give you the plot. And lots of houses didn't have numbers. So, and it's also worth checking your local archives again. I would reiterate what Karen has said. They may have maps that are not on the National Library of Scotland collection. Ordnance Survey, parish maps, town maps, etc. So check with them as well.
I was dealing with this very issue yesterday, trawling through the maps, and discovered in the contemporary map the street is no longer there, but in the maps that I could access, National Library of Scotland going up to 1960, the street was there. One of the things I just came up with randomly, which was so wonderful, was typing the street name into Google, and I found a postcard photo of it in 1905 for sale on eBay for £3, which I bought. And that relates to one of the stories in my book, which is based on a house purchase file at the Museum of Domestic Design and Architecture Archive, which is a wonderful archive at Middlesex University. So I'm going to donate, I've written a blog post about it, but I'm going to donate the postcard to them. But it was the family home of one of my first time homeowners, and it was just one of these wonderful things. And it is quite surprising how you find these postcards of streets. In one of my blog posts for Find My Past, I've got a wonderful postcard of the street my great-grandparents lived in, who I only realised when I started looking at the postcard and looking at the census, realised lived next door to each other when they were courting. And the families are still there in the 1921 census. I've got a whole news story around that as well. But postcards are amazing, and because they're being sold online and digitized, and there's the wonderful Tux postcard site. So if you want to see what the house looked like, because this is what I'm finding as well, is looking at, I'm looking at number of rooms on the census. I'm going onto Google Street View. I'm looking for estate agents' details, which often have floor plans, and I'm trying sort of everything I can to try and map, because there's a big difference between a spacious semi with 5 rooms and there is between a little terraced house with 5 rooms, because what it doesn't tell you is how big are those rooms and what were the conditions like. So I think you've got to think really imaginatively around it. But I often find estate agents' details useful, especially for floor plans.
Yeah, and as well as that, sometimes it's useful to contact your local planning department, because a lot of them have historic planning records, and sometimes they don't always survive, but sometimes they do. So it's just always worth dropping them a line, asking about historic planning records. And
kitchen extensions. I mean, one of the other houses I've written about, it's a house that I lived in that was a 1930s time capsule, but I discovered through the planning department that exactly when the kitchen extension was built, so in the 40s, which was just wonderful, because it totally made you rethink the way in which the space of the house was used.
Yeah,
wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We are at the top of the hour. I'm really sorry if we've not got to your question. I feel like we might need another session for questions alone, but more on that later. Thank you to our wonderful panel today. As I said at the beginning, the knowledge between the 4 of you is scarily good. So I am very, very grateful that you took the time out of your busy schedules to come and chat to me and also chat to our wonderful community. And I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. Community, I hope you guys have enjoyed yourselves too. Now, before we wrap up, I do just have to mention, I may pass to you about this as well. So there is a little event on Twitter happening tomorrow, isn't there? Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Our regular House History Hour, 7 o'clock every Thursday, is on the 1921 census tomorrow with Jen from Find My Past, and I'm the co-host for tomorrow. So, if you've got some more questions we didn't get to answer, come along and use the House History Hour hashtag and join in the conversation. And I think, as well as Jen and I sharing tips, I think we'll all be really interested to hear more about your tips and what you've discovered, because I think there's lots of thinking laterally around trying to find that the address that you want and the person that you want in the 1921 census.
Absolutely. And as I said at the beginning, House History Hour happens every week, slightly different co-host, slightly different guest. Really, really exciting. Lots of things to talk about. It's 7 till 8 o'clock, I believe. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, and if you can't join in, we also publish. Keith, who I think has been in the chat, very kindly puts together the highlights of every week's tweets into our moments. So you can actually, it's a fantastic resource, and we have a website as well. And this was a thing that we set up in lockdown, and it's just we've been going. What was it? May 2020 we started, and we've kept it going for this long. There is enough to talk about house history, and even if we revisit topics, there's always so much more to say, and we're always keen to hear from people about what they would like us to cover as well. So if you have a suggestion, drop us a direct message or just use our House History Hour hashtag to let us know.
Just what you were saying about the fact that House History Hour was set up in May 2020 and that you're still going, and you thought you'd probably run out of things to talk about by now. It's the same thing with Findmypast from home. We started it during lockdown as a way to connect with our lovely community, everybody watching at home today, and we're still going because it's just really, really nice to chat like this. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you, our lovely community. Thank you to our fantastic panel. I really must organise and have you back. I'll speak to Keith, see what he says. Yes, thank you so much. And enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Look after yourselves, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.